Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Join Not Pain, Automating Reports Within Your Capital Program. I'm your host, Evan Hill, with several exciting guests and a very exciting conversation lineup in prep for today's conversation. A couple of quick housekeeping items before we jump into this conversation and introduce our guests. First of all, right off the bat, I hope you enjoyed your holiday Thanksgiving last week. I hope you are still stuffed. I hope you are still full and potentially even going for round 17 while you're watching this webinar. So in terms of how we like to do webinars, we try to make it very conversational in nature and in format. So what does that mean? If you have questions or comments, but particularly questions throughout this webinar, we're going to set aside a time of probably around 20 to 30 minutes at the end to answer your questions in a roundtable format. So if you look at your go to webinar functionality tab on the right side of your screen, you should see a questions tab. If you click on that, you should be able to submit questions live throughout the webinar. So feel free to do that in real time. I will be tracking it throughout the webinar. And like I said, we will be answering, we'll try to answer every question. Typically we get a lot, so we try to get through as many as we can. But so that's the first housekeeping item. The second housekeeping item is this will be recorded and available on demand. So if you happen to need to leave halfway through, we hope you stay for the entire conversation. But if you need to leave halfway through or something like that, no problem whatsoever. We will send you an on-demand recording of the webinar after the fact via the email that you signed up with. With that said, I believe that concludes my housekeeping items, and I'm just double checking that. Oh, the final thing, if you want a certificate of completion, we can email that to you if you need it for your supervisor or your company. That's totally cool, and we'll get that sent to you over email at the end. But with that said, let me introduce our guests. We've got three really knowledgeable folks on today's conversation. I'll introduce all three total, and then I will have each of them individually tell us a little bit more about themselves before we kick off the conversation. First one is Gary Younger, Director and Program Manager of Project Controls at Northeastern University. We have Peter Urban, Vice President, KFA. And finally, we have Susan Parker, Product Manager, one of my colleagues at eBuilder, a Trimble company. I'm a Product Marketing Manager at eBuilder, and like I said, I'll obviously be hosting this conversation throughout today's webinar. With that said, let's start with Peter. Peter, why don't you share with the audience a little bit about yourself, both professionally as well as personally?
Sure. So hi, I'm Peter Urban. I'm with KFA. If you don't know KFA, we're a technology consulting firm that's been in business over 25 years, and we focus on the construction industry. I've been with the company for over 20 years. And a lot of the work that I've been involved in during the last 2 decades has been implementations of project management and program management systems for very large and very complex capital programs. My educational background and my early career was in architecture. That's where I started out, but very quickly.
I don't mind to cut you off, but we are getting some really tough feedback from your mic. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to, if you want to rejoin with the link and connect with Carolina to get that resolved, we'll come back to you. I promise you I won't skip you. Gary, why don't you share the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yep, thanks, Evan. So my name is Gary Younger. As Evan mentioned, I'm the Director of Program and Project Controls at Northeastern University. Been there about 7 years. Prior to that, I was with Harvard University for about 7 years. And then prior to that, I was with an airport authority up in the Northeast in the Boston area for about 14 years. My experience is basically overseeing project controls for large capital programs. So everything from PMIS implementations to reporting to business process, all those things that are related to delivering a sizable capital program. And I'm also an adjunct faculty over at Wentworth Institute of Technology up here in Boston, focusing on courses on estimating, project controls, CPM scheduling, and building systems.
Great. Susan, how about yourself?
Hello. Yes, I'm here in Wilmington, North Carolina, and I'm a product manager for eBuilder. I've been in construction technology on the software side for about 8 years, and then working for general contractors for a good 20 years or so before that. So, so I really enjoy working with the technology and seeing how it helps our construction teams pull together their projects.
Perfect. Thanks for joining today's conversation, Susan. Peter, were you able to get your audio working? Do we want to try this real quick?
How is this? Is this any better right now? Okay.
Why don't you share with the audience a little bit about yourself?
From the beginning. So I've been with KFA for over 20 years, and most of the work I've worked on over the past 2 decades has been involved in project management and program management systems, primarily focusing on owner organizations with large complex programs. My passions are really data structures, analyzing data, looking for trends, making sure data is being collected properly. So anything with the word data in it, I'm all over it.
Love it. Well, you are two of maybe the most insightful guests we've ever actually had in our webinar history. So I'm super excited for today's conversation. To kick us off, let's start with a foundational sort of question here. And I'll direct this one initially to you, Gary, and Peter, I'll give you an opportunity to chip in after him. Gary, what does an organization need to manage a capital program? What sort of data sources do you need? What sort of dashboards? What types of data do you need to capture? And how do you satisfy the needs of all these different stakeholders across a capital program?
Yeah, so I would kind of start by saying that I think, knowing the audience of who's in the organization, what are the things that are important to that organization to capture, I think that really kind of sets the stage. So what I mean by that is that if there are different stakeholders within the organization, and leadership may look for things that they need to make decisions on, so there are certain metrics that you need to be able to capture there. There's other data that's related to kind of just the overall day-to-day activities. So I think that's kind of really one of the first steps, that has to take place. I also think that, defining those metrics, really plays a pretty big role in how the data is going to get structured within the system, and the way that you're going to capture things. And one thing that we'll talk about a little bit further is that, a lot of this data that you report on needs to be part of the day-to-day process of managing the business. So I think if it's not really instilled in that process, then people end up backfeeding the system, putting information in there once a week or whatever, and it makes the accuracy of the reporting and the quality of the reporting, really challenging there. And I think it adds a lot of extra effort in trying to produce reports on a regular basis.
Peter?
Yeah, I agree with Gary. I mean, one of the first things you have to look at is what data is important, and you have to identify the sources of the data. And when we say sources, we're not just talking about software systems. We're also talking about the people, or where the data really originates, who's creating it, because it's really important to capture data at the source. And so when you're setting up an application, you have to make sure that it's set up so that the information is being captured from the real creators. Therefore, it's being captured real time, not post-processed. And you have to understand who's going to consume the data. So knowing these things helps you figure out and get to the requirements of what is it that we're going to capture, when, from whom, and how. And that begins the groundwork of establishing how you configure the system.
Peter, you mentioned something that I want to follow up on, and I want you to elaborate on. What are the effects of data not being captured directly in real time? What sorts of negative effects will that have on your program and your reporting capabilities?
Sure. First and foremost, it's the timing, right? I mean, we all want to say that we have real-time data, but if you're not getting it from the source, if the source is happening external to a software system and then it gets created as data later, you have a lag there. You also run the risk of having inaccurate data, because if it's not coming from the source, there's a good chance it's being transcribed or converted somehow. And so you may not be getting the same information from what was intended to be shown to you. So those are two very immediate artifacts.
Gary, anything you want to chip in there?
I'm just gonna, just kind of add on to what Peter was saying is that, it is really important to be able to capture that data actively. And like I said, I'm a huge proponent of whenever, a PMIS system goes in place, I think the business processes for that organization have to be intertwined with that. I think sometimes, the systems get put in place and they say, okay, it's going to do all these great things. And, at the end of the month or every 2 weeks, it's very challenging to kind of produce the reports that are being required because it hasn't been ingrained in the day-to-day business process. And, I think the reporting side of it, I think should be an easy aspect if everything is being captured as people are doing things. So, as an example, if I put in 5 change orders throughout the month and I add in commitments and I do all these things, at the end of the month, I should be able to have a report script that just says, hey, our budget is $100. We've got, 20 change orders or $20,000 for change orders and so on and so on. That data resides there and it should just be able to be captured pretty easily. And I think if the data is put in the system in that manner, then reporting isn't as heavy a lift as it has probably been, in the past of trying to gather data from multiple locations and, condense it into an Excel sheet, reformat it, regenerate it, and then get it out. That sometimes can take a couple of days, a month for a team to put together.
Susan, do you want to add anything onto that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I do see people get frustrated frequently when they're designing a project control system because reporting is an afterthought. And they just sort of think it's going to happen automatically, when really I find that you want to start with the end in mind. So really, when you're planning, even literally sketching out your reports of what you want to have at the end of the day, what do I need to have in order for my project teams to make good decisions and to get ahead of problems before they're irreversible. That's what I want in a report. So sometimes you might be replicating an existing report in just a different system, but a lot of times you have an opportunity to develop something completely new. So when you're sitting there and sketching out a report, you can think like, well, wouldn't it really make a difference if I had this data point? And then you can work backwards and figure out how you're going to collect it, how are you going to generate it, and to Gary's and Peter's point, have it be part of the day-to-day collection of people just doing their jobs.
Gary, you had mentioned in one of your earlier answers, you said the phrase, when an owner implements a PMIS. That rung a bell for me because one thing we commonly hear is that there are, and I know it's hard to believe, still some owners out there who haven't implemented a project management system to, track collaboration and information and project progress and all that fun stuff. But what does life look like, or have you seen what life looks like without a project management system in place and how that hampers reporting capabilities?
Yeah, I mean, so I have to say, years back, quite a few years back, I mean, I experienced it personally. I mean, I remember those days of trying to get data in Excel sheets and the days that it would take to put reports together. So, I definitely have experience and I felt the pain from that. And, I think, I guess I'll say this, I couldn't imagine, managing a capital program without some type of system like this in place today. I don't even think I would entertain a position if a place didn't have some type of system to manage this, because it just creates a lot of extra work when it's not there. So I know, organizations have certain restrictions or they have certain limitations on what they can procure and implement. But, I think the days, as everyone knows, of not having it in place and run off Excel are by the wayside at this point,
Peter, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I can relate as well. I've actually, you reminded me of a situation where I was working with a client who did have a PMIS system. So they were managing their costs in the system. But I was working on something with a project manager and we were troubleshooting invoices. And I said, well, let's look at the log. And he takes out his paper notebook where he literally uses pencil and paper to track his invoice and change order log. And I said, well, wait a minute, John, there's the PMIS system. He said, yeah, but I don't trust that. And it turned out he had paper, his construction manager had spreadsheets, and we had the PMIS system. And there were cases where the three didn't align. And the lesson there is trust the data. You have to agree that there's going to be one central governing source, and you have to trust that data. And if there's a problem, focus on that one source and fix it there instead of spending time and effort trying to reconcile three other pieces of paper and spreadsheets.
Yeah, I think that's one of the benefits or the main value props, I would say, of a project management information system is its sole source. Everybody who's involved in a project, all those different stakeholders from contractors, subs, project managers, even board executive level directors can go into a project management system like eBuilder and generate those reports in real time. I was just having a conversation with a colleague the other day. It's really about, I would say, shortening the distance from the time an action was completed to being able to report on that. I think Gary had mentioned like life before a project management solution was, it took hours and hours, sometimes even a full work week for a project manager to be able to generate a report for an executive or a board level member, whether it's cash flow or project delivery timeline. By the time they've done the work to generate that report, it's a week, 2 weeks out of date. So it really is an exhausting process for, I would say that that report generation process from a manual perspective can be really exhausting.
Yeah, I was just going to say one other thing too is that, trying to create that report, I think all of us can kind of, relate to, the end of the month closes on the 30th or 31st, and it's kind of a rush job to try to get it out by the 15th. And if you run a little bit late, then like you said, that data gets older and it's not as relevant. The other thing I was going to say too is that I think there's a trust factor with the data, and what I mean by that is that I think it's better to have a little less coming out of the gate, but have it be accurate and people can depend on it and can value it, and then be able to build on it. I think if you come out of the gate saying you're going to accomplish all these things and have all this data and it's incomplete or inaccurate, you lose a lot of buy-in quickly, and I think it's better to have an initial set that's right on the money and that provides value to people, and then as you go, you add more to it, and it becomes even more valuable. But I think there's a big trust factor, with the data that comes out of these systems that has to be instilled in people too.
Peter, I'll throw this one your way, shifting the conversation just a little bit. To get more specific, what sorts of reports do you benefit from the most being automated by a project management system? What reports are you using daily and relying on?
Well, everybody probably wants to hear or expects to hear cost reports. Knowing where your project is financially is important, and it is. You need to know, where you are with your budgets and your commitments and invoices. But there's another category that's important, and that's just process tracking and what's in flight, how long has it been in flight, and a process could be anything from a invoice review to a request for information to a submittal to virtually anything. Having basically automated logs of these processes and knowing who scored it in, how long it's been there, is anything overdue. That's important because these are the things that lead to cost overruns and other types of issues. If questions aren't being answered in a timely fashion, you should expect change orders and other things like that. So those are the basic types. But I also, as a system administrator, I also look for reports that catch exceptions. So we often work with clients to help them identify things that are out of the norm. So, whether it's processes that are aged over an expected number of days or whatever, we make sure we set up reports and automated alerts for those things, because to me, reports should be automated. They shouldn't just be, I can click a button and get information, but they should also be pushed to me when necessary so that I don't have to even ask a question. Alerts are fed to me to tell me that there's a problem here. So exception reports of various types is another category that we like to focus on. And I've got lots more, but I'm going to give Gary a chance.
Yeah, just to add on to what Peter was saying is that, a lot of the reports that are kind of the standards that everyone looks at for a program or project, cost, schedule, as Peter mentioned, processes where things are at. One of the things that we try to push forward is that the report shouldn't just tell you everything that you have done in the last month, but they should also be able to kind of tell you where you're going. And I think there's a lot of value in being able to have reports that identify trends and some of the things that may be coming up that you have to address. So I think there's a real balance there of running those reports and getting that information. It shouldn't all be everything we've done in the past. I mean, it's good to know that, and how much have we spent in the last month, things like that, because it gives you a good sense of what's going on. But where are we going, and is there anything that we need to address before we get there? I think that's important too.
Gary, you gave me you reminded me of an example when you said kind of looking into the future. We had a client that had a very large program with 600 projects running, and they had a small team that needed to respond to submittals, and they were on a 7-day calendar week with responses. So some of their submittals were due on Saturdays and Sundays, and we set up reports that alerted people of what's coming, we were able to predict what submittals were going to land in which department's court in the next few days based on where they had already been in previous days, so that people could look and say, do I have to work this weekend to catch up on submittals that are due before Monday? So being able to predict through reporting might sound kind of far-fetched and future-like, but it's not. It's possible to do even with pretty basic tools.
Yeah. Another type of report that I think of is monthly progress reports, where you need to talk to a wide range of people who might be outside of your management system and give them a bunch of different things. So you're pulling together reports from different areas, assembling them together, and have some narrative and some analysis along with it, and sending it to a wide range of people. So being able to pull that together can really be a lot of work. That can be a couple of days, sometimes every month for a project manager, if they don't have some of that automated or planned out ahead of time.
One question that was asked, and I'm just going to bring it up now, is are there different reports that matter differently to different types of owners? For example, if you're in the government space, you're more in the public space, are there different reports that are more important to you than, say, an owner building, a casino or something like that? Peter, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, we thought about this a little bit, and the first answer is no. Construction is construction, right? Everybody has budgets and commitments and invoices, and they have similar ways of looking at it. So it didn't look at first like there was a big difference in different verticals or different industries. But there are a few dividing lines. For example, public agencies or publicly funded projects, they tend to have a large focus on funding information, which in the private sector maybe is a smaller priority item. And so, you look at the importance of certain types of reports may differ based on public versus private. So those are a couple examples.
Yeah, and I would just add on to that. I think funding really is a big one, and I think that really is a distinction between kind of owners and other entities, GCCMs. I know, working for an airport authority, there are a lot of different funding sources that have to be accounted for. There's PFCs, there's multiple bond issuance to do capital projects and those things, and those different funding sources have to be managed independently, but they're part of the whole of a project. So a lot of times you have to slice and dice projects based on how they've been funded. So I really think that's probably a real distinct difference there.
There could also be considerations with access to reports and data based on type of project. So again, I don't necessarily mean to draw the line between public and private, but it tends to be that publicly managed projects may have different access controls requirements in terms of who should see which data and with whom would we share what data, versus a privately controlled project versus perhaps an open book project where an owner might share a lot more cost data with their contractors and vendors. So not only is it the type of report, but it's the contents of the report may have to be developed slightly differently based on what your relationship structure is like.
Go ahead, Gary.
No, I was just kind of going on with what Peter says. I mean, I basically agree with him wholeheartedly on that.
Susan?
Well, when I hear about data access too for public entities, I also think about entities that have sunshine laws where, sometimes you need to keep the information tight because it's confidential, but sometimes you have to have it readily available to anyone who may ask to see information if it's a government entity possibly.
Peter, I wanted to drill down a little bit further on something you mentioned, and I'm going to throw you on the spot a little bit. Are there any like hard lessons learned from your first couple go-arounds of automating your reporting capabilities with a project management system? Are there any hard lessons learned that you were like, oh, I'll never do that again? And I know I'm throwing you on the spot, but I'm curious.
Yeah, we didn't rehearse that question. Let's see. So, Gary said something that I wanted to repeat, which is, my translation of what Gary said, which is no data is sometimes or usually better than bad data. And we've seen situations where you're in a rush to produce a report or a dashboard or some information, and you miss a key, filter or a key element of what you're producing, and it turns out to be incorrect. And that's, that's really bad. So the lesson learned is, analyze and reanalyze and check and recheck those reports before you share and make them public, because one of the key things that reports are used for is decision making. And if your report is off, and all it takes is one bad filter to completely throw off your data, you have a problem. So, making sure things are accurate, making sure that they tell the full picture too. Sometimes, and we know you can put a different spin on everything, depending on what picture you want to show, you can spin it, different ways. And be honest with yourself and make sure that you are presenting the data in as neutral a way as possible. What I mean by that is, there's things like you could show things as this thing was completed twice as fast as previously done, or it was completed 50% faster than was previously done. Those two numbers, look different in a chart or graph, 50% versus 200%, but they might be telling the same story. So, presenting the data in an honest fashion is important.
Gary, any personal experience? I'm going to ask the same question to you. Any sort of hard lessons learned that you feel like you would benefit from sharing?
Yeah, I think it's pretty simplistic, kind of when I look at it, is I really think that the timeliness and the accuracy of the data are the two biggest drivers. And I say that in the sense of, just gaining overall adoption and being able to support, in organization. And one of the things is when you talk with different organizations, they may have different sizable capital programs, and some organizations spend $500 million a year on capital stuff, and others, spend less. But I think the point is that, having processes in place and reporting that supports that, I think is really critical to, expending those dollars and getting the most benefit out of those dollars. Sometimes, you think you have, this large sum of money, and it's, oh, great, we can do all these things. But there's a lot of different reporting requirements and things that are needed to expend that money and accomplish a project. And I think, being able to have some system in place and reporting that, kind of creates the roadmap, I think is very important to that,
Peter, you had mentioned a previous example of how a project manager, I think, was doing some cost calculations or scheduling calculations on what was like a napkin on the back of a piece of paper. One element of the conversation I want to drill down into is adoption of a project management system. Both you, Peter, and Gary are leaders within your respective organizations. What sort of advice would you give to other leaders transitioning their capital programs to a project management system in terms of driving that adoption among different collaborators across the project? How do you get everybody using one sort of platform or system to collaborate, exchange data, information, and ultimately drive success? Peter, I'll start with you.
Sure. Adoption sort of comes from, in one sense, it comes from ease of use. Certainly an owner can mandate use of a system, but if it's not easy to use, people are going to struggle with it. So kind of working backwards from ease of use, we look at things like making sure that the system is configured to provide some kind of benefits to all the participants. So if your PMIS is going to have participation from owner members as well as outside vendor, contractors, consultants, whatever, you have to give each of those team members some kind of benefit from the system, whether that means they can easily go and look at, status of where their invoice is as a self-service without having to make phone calls, or whatever, provide some kind of benefit to every player in that. And in order to provide benefits, working backwards from that, it requires that you include these other vendors or other team members in the development of the requirements of the system. So when we design processes, when we design folder structures, when we design whatever aspect of the system we're talking about, we make sure we're not only hearing from the owner, but we're also hearing from representatives of their construction contractor and consultant community so that we get their perspective in the system too.
Yeah. And I would just go along with that too. I mean, I think, trying to change the culture to adapt to the system is really important. And what I mean by that is that, sometimes, a new system will come in and it'll want to get implemented, and, people will say, well, this is this person's idea, this is what they want to bring in. And, it's not really fully implemented. But I think kind of communicating that, we're going to improve the way that that we do the business here. And it's not just the software, it's looking at, all the ways that we deliver capital projects and what needs to be tweaked, what needs to be changed, and how does the system then support that. I think people then can, get a better feeling for like, okay, we're just trying to make overall process improvements here, and this system is going to help us actually get there. So, I feel strongly that it's not always just bringing a software in there. I think it's a cultural change that has to take place also. And I think when you do that, and I think when you respect people's feelings and you respect their ideas and you respect the things that are important to them, people will then go along with you. And I think that's really important.
Susan, I'm gonna throw you on the spot a little bit. I'm curious for your the eyes you gave me just now were not great, but I'm gonna do it anyway. From a product manager's perspective, what sorts of things are important to you in terms of as a builder of one of these products, eBuilder project management system, what sorts of things are driving you, or are you working on to make it useful for everybody throughout a project?
Well, if we're talking about reporting specifically, we have, we look at a couple of different areas for being able to pull the information out. And we have a wide range of user ability to be able to develop reports. So we may have something, have one part of our reporting that gives you a wizard where you can actually walk through and step through the information. And then for more advanced people, we might have something like our BI tool where you have more free form and more graphical capabilities. But we're trying to address a wide range of people. And sometimes, it takes a certain amount of understanding the data behind the scenes for people like Peter and Gary and their teams to pull together these reports. So that gets a little bit tricky in itself too.
Good answer though. Glad I threw you on the spot for that one. Peter, one of the values I feel like that comes with a project management system like eBuilder is the value of, or the capability of integration with other systems, whether it's finance, accounting, invoicing, getting contractors paid. What sorts of, in your perspective, what sorts of benefits come from those integration capabilities? And as a follow-up, what integrations does your organization rely on?
Sure. So integrations are often a necessity, and that comes from, I don't think there's any organization that uses one single software product to manage everything about their projects and programs, right? There are enterprise financial systems, which have a certain purpose. There are project management systems which have a certain purpose, and other types of systems. And so, in order to get best of breed, you end up with a toolbox of software. So you need to integrate certain aspects of these things, whether that means you pass, an invoice from one system to another, which then cuts a check or whatever it is. You do these things because you have to, but you have to because the alternative is to do it manually and do double data entry, and double data entry means double the effort and double the risk of things being transposed and converted and entered improperly, right? So, the benefits of an integration are obviously the automation of data being sent from one system to another and then back, if necessary, to make sure that information is in sync. With that said, you want to make sure that the systems are not completely overlapping. We've encountered organizations where they do have two software products and the two software products do the same exact thing. Well, that's a problem. There certainly is the aspect of shared data, but the purpose or the management of that data in two different systems should really be slightly different. Otherwise, you've got a problem. So those are some things to look at. Those are some of the benefits. What do we typically see? Typically, the sort of most common targets of integrations are cost information, contracts, because contracts might originate in a PMIS system, and then once they're approved, they have to be fed to a financial management system where they're tracked. If you do contracts, you typically have to do change orders and invoices because they all kind of come together as a domino effect. So those are the most common items. And again, the most common integrations are between enterprise financial system and a project management system, which really are two completely different systems if people don't know that.
Gary?
Yeah, I would just add on to that, and saying any PMI system that gets implemented today, there's always a discussion about how will it integrate with my accounting system. I think those two things pretty much go hand in hand nowadays when somebody's considering that. From our standpoint and our ideas behind it is that we think data should only be entered in once. And what I mean by that is that if I'm going to enter a budget in a system, and whether it would probably be in a PMIS system first, but if it resided somewhere else, that data should move to the appropriate system. Like, I shouldn't have to re-enter a budget ever again in the process. I may enter budget changes, but I should never have to re-enter that. And I think that's a really important aspect of kind of integrations. And as Peter said, overlapping of systems, preventing that, because each system has its own purpose. So, on the finance side, we're trying to integrate everything on the cost side from general ledger, just non-commitment transactions, invoices, all of those things. And it's a huge time saver. When we first did this, we went through and we looked to see this investment that we were going to put into it, how much time would it save? And when we took everything into account, it saved us about 96 days a month of a full-time person. I should not a month, I mean a year, I meant to say 96 days a year for a full-time person. And that makes quite a big impact there. And the other thing too is, we also look at other systems that are out there. We have integrated work management systems. We have, space planning systems. All these different applications store data that is of value to the overall program. So integrations, I think, are a really big piece of it.
Well, we are going to close on that for the initial portion of our webinar today. We're going to shift into the Q&A session. We've had several good questions come up. The first one is around transparency, and this is an interesting one. It's a little bit of a softball, but Peter, I'm going to start with you on it. What is the impact of automated reports on transparency within project and capital program progress? What sorts of, in terms of knowing where the progress is happening, where work is getting done, where work is not getting done, that theme of transparency, how does it impact your organization?
It gets work done. I mean, the bottom line is when information is transparent and everybody on the team can see whose court something is in and how long it's been there, people tend to want to get their work done so they look good. And so, in our early days, that's one of the first impacts or one of the first benefits we noticed is that the process cycle times were improving because nobody wanted to get called out and say they have too many things in their court for too long.
Yeah, and I would actually go along with that and say that, when we first put this in place there, there is a lot of transparency in the system from reporting and just other processes. And I think from the owner's standpoint, that actually puts them on the spot too. because how they're processing things internally is kind of exposed. If it's taken a long time or it's sitting on somebody's desk, everyone on the team sees it now. So it does cause you to step up a little bit more because you don't want to be that bottleneck there. But it goes both ways, and I think the owner has to step up too.
That kind of gets back to what Peter was talking about earlier too, about exception reports. And I love that idea too. It's one thing to get a log of all my submittals that are in review, but maybe there's reports that I need to see that are just telling me, here are the 3 or 4 that are about to blow up on me, where the dates are really out of compliance, or here's a designer that I use regularly that always has a long lag time across all my projects. Being able to pull that type of information for exceptions really is just valuable for that transparency idea too.
I think
Peter, go ahead, Peter.
Another example that just came to mind is if you have an overall picture of where you stand financially across an entire program or portfolio of projects, you're able to save money. And I think we've all heard of examples where a program manager sees that he has a deficit on one project, but he can immediately see where he has a surplus on a couple of other projects and be able to move money around and still, manage to come within an overall budget. So having this data at your fingertips saves you time and allows you to make better decisions. Instead of asking for more funding, you have visibility into, or transparency, if you will, into where else do I have money that I can take from.
Yeah. Or even just, it doesn't even have to be money. It can be just performance of a particular contractor across a portfolio. If I'm having problems on one project, I might be able to leverage something on another project where that company is working.
Yeah,
just
to go along with that, we've actually put reports in place that based on, when a project gets completed, there's a process in which we evaluate the firms that have worked on that project. And to go along with the whole reporting, we're now able to look at all of the firms that work with us, and we have them on a point scale of 1 through 5. So we quickly see that this firm is scored at a 4.2, and they've worked on 10 projects, and this is what their score is. And based on what the input is from the project manager or other clients, that helps kind of identify, is this a solid firm or is it a firm we need to look at a little bit closer? So that is
building into your pre-qualification of your vendors too. I guess you're building your own pre-qualification database there. It's great.
Yeah, it works pretty well in that aspect.
So we'll close on this question, and we discussed it off and on throughout today's webinar, but I think it's important to spell it out. As leaders within your respective organizations, obviously the benefits of automated reports from a project manager's perspective is obvious. They're not doing 30, 40 hours manual work to generate a report that's out of date a week later by the time it's generated. But from an executive level or from a board level's perspective, what is the value of these automated reports? And Peter, I'll start with you.
I think, most of these things have already been said one way or another, but accuracy is one. If the automation is correctly set up, nobody's manually, apologies for that, nobody's manually going in and inputting data. So accuracy, timeliness. If it's automated to the extent that it can be, you don't have that lag. I think, Evan, you said, you were giving examples of, or Gary, examples of reports being delayed 1 or 2 weeks. I mean, I've seen reports with 2 to 3 month old data that are presented to boards of directors. And, that, to me, that's just kind of funny. There's got to be a better way. So, trying to get information more quickly, more timely, so that, decisions aren't being made 3 months after the fact, they're being made real time.
Gary?
Yeah, and I would just add to that, it's, I have kind of 2 real world examples. One is cash flow reporting that we do and a monthly capital program report. So just to kind of summarize, the cash flow information, we have that get generated on the 1st of every month automatically. So that report gets generated, it's scheduled, we don't even have to hit the button for it. And we then can review that information, make some tweaks to it, and then get that cash flow out to our treasury unit. We also have a capital program monthly report that has different components, and those reports all run automatically also, at the 1st of the month. And we're able to take that data in those formats and just combine it into a PDF and create a very professional looking complete report that takes much less time than it would if we had to kind of go through and manually do all this information. So huge time savings there. I mean, our goal is to have all of our cost reports out by like the 7th or 8th of the month and be done with it.
Love it. Well, that conversation was super insightful. So I hope everybody who tuned in today got value out of this conversation. I have to thank our guest, Gary Younger, Director of Program and Project Controls at Northeastern University, Peter Urban, Vice President of KFA, and finally, Susan Parker, my colleague, Product Manager at eBuilder. Gentlemen and lady, thank you so much for attending today's conversation. A couple of quick items before we sign off. Like I said, this webinar will be available on demand. You will receive it in your email, and it will also be accessible via the eBuilder website. If you have any other questions or concerns or anything that came up throughout this webinar, maybe a question we didn't get to or something that came up after the fact, feel free to email us. We'll contact you, get in touch, and get some answers from Peter or Gary on that. So with that said, that concludes today's webinar, Joy Not Pain, Automating Reports Within Your Capital Program. And the final note I'll make is this webinar was actually based off of a Cornerstone page that our marketing team authored. We brought in several different SMEs, Peter and Gary and others all made super valuable contributions to that Cornerstone page. It's all about how to automate reports within your capital program, the different types of reports that provide value to you, how to make that, how to effectively adopt it and effectively utilize those reports within your program. So that link will be dropped within the chat if you want to go and read it after the fact. But with that said, thank you everyone for attending today's conversation. We appreciate your time and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks.